Hey, Angela, thank you as always for your wonderful help and support. Aksha, those were powerful words you shared. Andrew, that was a fabulous pledge drive testimonial. I'm just so joyful and happy about, in spite of all the things that Aksha talked about in the world, I'm just so joyful and happy to be here in this beloved community. And I'm also very, very glad to be sharing a service with you about the late Pauli Murray as part of our congregation's celebration of Black History Month. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Pauli Murray is one of the most important people in the history of our country who very few people until recent years have ever heard of. Her ideas, her scholarship, and her activism played a pivotal role in two movements that forever transformed this nation, the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Supreme Court's landmark decision, Brown v. Board of Education, a decision that made segregation in public education unconstitutional. But not many people are aware that a key legal argument that was at the center of the NAACP's brief to the Supreme Court justifying overturning segregation, that argument was first made in a law school paper that Pauli Murray wrote when she was a student at Howard Law School. I would also add, some years after the Brown decision, Andrew, this is really for you, there's a lot of law school stuff here. So some years after the Brown decision, a constitutional lawyer that you may have heard of, future Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, used arguments made in a law review article, again written by Pauli Murray, and arguing before the Supreme Court that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment had to apply to women. The future Justice Ginsburg, needless to say, won that case and acknowledged her debt to Pauli Murray by adding Murray's name to the brief that she submitted to the court. Now, that's already one heck of a resume, I would say, but that is not even really the most important or compelling parts, I think, of Pauli Murray's, not only her legal career, but her extraordinary life and her amazing story. And what I think makes Murray's story so important for us today is that she lived her life and changed the world at the intersection of race, class, and gender. As Murray herself experienced time and again, so often our identities are used to demean, to dehumanize, and to divide the world into us and them, loved and unloved, privileged and oppressed. Pauli Murray understood that oppression and injustice take place at multiple and often interconnected levels. To give you just one example, Murray wrote powerfully about the myriad ways that race and gender were used to systematically marginalize African American women, creating a system of interlocking oppressions that she called Jane Crow. So let me back up and tell you a little bit more of Murray's remarkable story. She was born in Baltimore in 1910. Sadly and tragically, both of her parents died while she was a very young child. Pauli then moved to North Carolina, where she really grew up and was raised by her aunt Pauline, for whom she had been named. Now, growing up in the Deep South, Pauli most assuredly experienced what she called in the reading you heard, the monster of segregation on a daily basis. After the Supreme Court, in I think it was 1898, legalized segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson, North Carolina and states across the South passed one law after another that consigned African Americans to separate public facilities, attending separate and always poorly funded public schools, and to sitting in the back of buses and other forms of public transportation. From a very, very young age, Pauli Murray learned that separate is never equal. And that lesson, as you heard earlier, created in her an uncompromising determination to end segregation. Even as a child, she refused to cooperate with Jim Crow laws, often choosing to walk rather than riding segregated buses. And when it came time for Pauli to go to college, she did not want to attend a segregated college in North Carolina and instead made her way to New York City, where she graduated from Hunter College in 1933. Now, I want to pause Pauli's life's, the chronology of her life story here to talk about one of those intersecting identities that I mentioned earlier, Pauli Murray's gender identity. You see, Pauli's name, as I said before, was actually Pauline. She never wanted to be known as Pauline. And the reason she preferred the name Pauli stemmed from the fact that from a very, very young age, when she was a young girl, Pauli knew that she was male, born in a female assigned at birth body, that she was Paul rather than Pauline. Growing up, Pauli felt more at home doing things that were considered tomboyish, and she frequently dressed like a boy, like a male, and then later a young man. I think there's a couple of pictures there. Aunt Pauline called Pauli my little boy girl, and there are the images of Pauli as a younger person. Now, I wish I could tell you that Pauli Murray was able to live as the person that she was, an African-American man. But she couldn't, because the world she was born into had no acceptance, no understanding, no willingness to conceive of gender as anything but a category fixed by the sexual organs one happens to be born with. As one of her biographers pointed out, had Pauli been born a couple of generations later, she would have been able to openly embrace her true gender identity and could have undergone gender-affirming surgery. In fact, for much of her life, Pauli pleaded with physicians to prescribe for her male hormones. But she never received the hormones she pleaded for, and she was never able to live outwardly as a male. She always felt compelled to keep her true identity, her true self, hidden. Pauli lived as a woman, dressed as a woman, and always used female pronouns, which is why I'm referring to her as she and her, even though she was male. Even later in life, when Pauli wrote a highly acclaimed autobiography, which I'll show you the picture of the cover if you're looking for more things to read about her a little bit later in the service. Even in that autobiography, there's hardly a mention of her gender dysphoria and the intense emotional pain she experienced from not being able to live as the person she truly was. Now, I want to say that the more I've learned about Pauli Murray's struggles with gender identity and her passion for social justice, the more I'm reminded of another remarkable person and a former congregant of mine when I served a UU congregation in Ohio, whose name was Susan Davis. And I found a picture of Susan. That's Susan. She was a force of nature, I'll tell you. Susan was male assigned at birth, born in the late 1930s, and from a very young age knew that she was female. She told me once that her father would come into her room and see Harley, as her name was when she was born, wearing a sister's dresses and pajamas, and would very gently say, "No, those aren't yours." Thankfully for her, Susan was able to access the gender-affirming healthcare denied to Pauli Murray and lived the last quarter of her life no longer openly and proudly as a woman. I also mentioned that Susan was passionate about social justice, and as I reflect on the extraordinary passion that she and Pauli Murray had, I have no doubt that that passion, that determination came from their experiences of being marginalized. Of course, as Susan herself acknowledged, the oppression that she experienced never reached the level of that experienced by people of color, and especially trans people of color. But both Susan and Pauli Murray felt the repeated sting of being told, who you are is not acceptable. Keep quiet. Stay in your place. Thankfully, neither one of them kept quiet, and the world is so much better because of their courage and commitment. Now, there's so much more I could tell you about Pauli Murray. As you've already heard, she was a gifted writer and poet, published several volumes of poetry, and I will share another one of her poems as the closing words to our service. Pauli Murray was a social activist and protester who fought to desegregate the law school at the University of North Carolina, who organized protests and sit-ins during the 1940s at segregated restaurants in Washington, D.C., and who was arrested and imprisoned right here in Virginia for refusing to sit in the back of a Greyhound bus. That bold act of defiance made the press, made the media, and I think it's fair to say that that act of defiance, which was in the mid to late 1940s, was noticed and influenced later movements that you may have heard of, the Montgomery bus boycott and the Freedom Riders during the Civil Rights Movement. Now, I also should mention, and Pauli Murray is often remembered for this, that she had an interesting and decades-long friendship with none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, a friendship that began in typical Pauli Murray fashion when she wrote a scathing letter to the then First Lady, accusing FDR of caring more about fascism overseas than racism and white supremacy at home. That was true. It's a picture of the two of them. Now, let me give Mrs. Roosevelt some credit here. Rather than getting angry, saying throw that letter in the trash, she invited young Pauli Murray to tea. They soon became friends and lifelong correspondents, although their friendship would be tested from time to time by the stinging words that often filled Murray's letters. Mrs. Roosevelt was especially annoyed when Pauli published a poem during the Second World War lambasting FDR for only expressing regret about an outbreak of brutal police violence against the Black community in Detroit. But in spite of that, Mrs. Roosevelt never lost her respect for Pauli Murray's commitment to justice, and they remained good friends until Eleanor Roosevelt died in 1962. Let me say a word about Pauli Murray's later years, when she turned her attention to gender discrimination. Now, in addition to providing those legal arguments for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Murray served on an important presidential commission on the status of women and wrote another highly influential legal article that was used to justify adding discrimination on the basis of sex to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 2 years later, Pauli Murray saw her dream of establishing an organization somewhat modeled on the NAACP for women. And so she helped found NOW, the National Organization for Women. Are you getting the picture here? Pauli Murray never stopped. She never stopped writing, never stopped resisting, never stopped showing up for justice. And just when it seemed when she seemed to be settling into a life of writing and teaching, when she hit her late 50s and early 60s, oh no, Pauli Murray heard a call to ministry. And after graduating from seminary, she became the first African-American woman in the history of this country to ever be ordained as an Episcopal priest. And there's a picture of Pauli Murray. I don't know about you, but man, I would have loved to heard Pauli Murray preach from this pulpit right here. Now, would you believe that because of her age, I wonder if there was more to it than that. I kind of suspect there was. She was never allowed to serve as a parish priest, and instead spent most of her ministerial career visiting the sick and guest preaching for $25 a sermon. Let me say this, if Pauli Murray were still alive, I guarantee you she would preach from this pulpit and we'd pay her a heck of a lot more than $25. Now, although Pauli Murray died almost 40 years ago, there's no question that her legacy lives on. While few people knew of her during her lifetime or in the years immediately following her death, things are changing. Some exceptionally good books have been published about Murray in recent years, and there's also a really good documentary. I think I watched it on Prime Video, but I can't remember where it's streaming right now. And here's an image of 3 books that I have consulted and that I really like. So the one on the left is by Rosalind Rosenberg, Jane Crow. The one in the middle is a very well-known book by Patricia Bell Scott about her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And that's Pauli Murray's autobiography, which was republished recently, her memoir with the title Song in a Weary Throat. All 3 of those books are good. And I just thought, I know Unitarian Universalists are going to come up to me after the service and say, so what book should I read about? So there you go. So let me conclude by quoting again the words from Pauli's essay, An American Credo, that Angela read earlier. And I think this feels like a call to action for the times we are in right now. When others try to draw a circle to exclude, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. When they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all humankind. With humility, but with pride, I shall offer one small life for whatever it is worth to fulfill the prophecy that all people are created equal. Thank you, Pauli Murray, for your blessed and wonderful life. May your memory and your wisdom always be a blessing.